Hi, everyone. This is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon and Internet 2. Thank you for joining us today for IAM Online, which is brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2. I will point out a couple of things. One is we use the chat function in Zoom for questions and comments, and you have to click on the chat button in order to see it. So you should see that at the bottom of your screen. And also, as you're looking at the chat, make sure that if you post something, you select all participants and attendees so that everybody can see what your question is. And without further ado, I'll introduce Tom Barton from the University of Chicago and Internet 2, who is our moderator today. Tom?
Thanks, Dean. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to introduce, I think, a really interesting topic that Jim and Christos are going to carry most of the water on. Thanks, Dean. Go ahead and advance to that slide. And I just wanted to start off by reminding us, kind of if we can weigh out what this is all about, enabling academic collaboration of all kinds of sorts by means of federation. And so reminding us that in all those different countries where there are national federations running and joined together by EduGain, there are faculty, staff, students and staff, and all the stuff that they're accessing, their data, other intellectual property, specialized instruments, specialized computing facilities, and so forth, operated by organizations all around the world. And that all that stuff is connected by global federation. And also to note, when we're looking at this picture, there's a few different types of roles that different sorts of people play in making that all happen. You'll see identity providers. Those are the folks that run the federated entities that users log in from, the home organizations. Like for me, it's the University of Chicago. There's service providers. Those are the folks who operate the service platforms that people log into to do things of various sorts. There's federation operators, and there's an EduGain operator, and then sometimes a service provider is kind of self-contained, and other times it's really more of a gateway over to a whole other scene over there where there's a lot of other things using their own internal means of coordinating, transactions amongst themselves, and they're simply connected to RNE federation so that they can benefit from federated access. Next slide, please, Dean. Thank you. So, of course, we've got a lot. We could congratulate ourselves. The federation, international federation, has gotten to be really international. It's pretty big, and getting a lot bigger. A lot of countries and entities and users and so forth. And that, at minimum, enables login, authentication to happen quite broadly. But is that enough? Next slide, please, Dean. No, it's a short answer to that question. There we go. So really, because those service providers and those academic service providers in particular have to protect the resources, and there's a variety of things that they have to do so, and I'm going to focus in on that for a couple minutes in just a moment. But they depend upon what the identity providers bring to the table in that federated access environment. And so I've kind of sketched out a couple of levels of that here. One is this enabling basic collaboration capabilities that are just critical to a wide range of academic collaboration scenarios. The baseline expectation programs that InCommon has meant to address. Thank you, Dean. You can find your way back to that slide. That would be good. Perfect. Thank you. Address some of those needs, particularly, some logos and user experience kinds of elements and metadata and so forth. There's certify for security needs, or really kind of baseline level of sort of security, and the basic level of research and scholarship attribute release that so many academic SPs need. So those are additional things that IDPs can bring. And then going up the value chain, when there's greater risk to manage, sometimes there's greater concern about that the academic service provider operators have, in terms of the strength of the assurance and details about the nature of the attributes that are being sent to it. But I'm going to focus on the top of the pyramid, really, to kind of manage risk, and I kind of want to peer into a little bit what's it take, sort of, to manage an academic service provider and what's up with the risk. So, Dean, if you can get us started with the next slide. So I want to take two use cases, a commercial service provider, and think about examples like Box or Google Docs or something. These are the kinds of things that campuses tend to contract for and integrate into the mix of services that a central IT unit provides to the campus as part of their enterprise suite of applications, enabling all the different things people at the campus do. And the other use case is an academic SP, and for canonical examples, think about the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which is one research community who operates a sort of a portal into a bunch of resources and tools that research community uses to do its work. And another type is the Indiana University Cyber Infrastructure Gateway, which is a way that IU enables their researchers to have their collaborators throughout have access to IU high-performance computing resources by means of federated access. Next slide, please, Dean. So in the commercial SP, there's a really key and valuable ingredient of a contract between them and an IDP at campus that's contracted with them to provide those services on their campus. And then on the right-hand side, Dean, if you advance, compared to that with an academic SP, things are by default usually a little more complicated. First of all, there's generally multiple campuses that provide users who access the academic SP, and those are connected via just federation, so nothing like the terms of a contract for both good and ill. And likewise, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes an academic SP, like that thing I showed in the first slide, you know, the whole kind of blob in red hanging off to the left, has a bunch of other services behind it, and they'll have whatever kind of arrangements amongst themselves. I'll call them MOUs here, Memorandums of Understanding. But again, generally looser than a contractual arrangement about how everything should work. Next slide, please. So I picked a set of things that have to do with managing stuff, managing services, and you can see a list. You could maybe get a better list, but it's just a representative list that I can use for comparative analysis, which we'll do by starting with the next slide. And so looking at how those types of management capabilities are discharged in the commercial SP use case, you can see that pretty much everything, the authorization, you know, which users are authorized to access the service, what's their identifiers, what attributes they're going to send along in the login transactions to the service provider is probably something agreed under contract, whether the two-factor is required or not. The user support is all on campus. Security is really a campus security operation. There's some of the terms are shared with the commercial SP by means of the contract. And then there's group and role management, which is generally, it's often just the campus, sometimes it's just the commercial SP, oftentimes it's a little bit of both. So there's a little bit of complexity there. Next slide, please. And you can contrast this with the situation for an academic service provider, where the authorization policy is split between the proxy, the service provider itself, and all the services that it's proxying for. The campuses have nothing to do with that as a rule. Like the campus, the University of Chicago has no value to add in terms of how the Oceans Observatory works, for example, or IU's HPC stuff. The user identifiers and attributes are kind of shared. The management of those things, they have to come from the campus IDP, and they may be supplemented perhaps or integrated or canonicalized by the academic SP. Likewise, strong authentication, both share a role there. In terms of the access management or group or role management, that's going to be split between the SP and the services behind it. User support, likewise, is split between the academic SP and the campus IDPs. And I guess there's some facility there about knowing when what kind of user error under what error circumstances should the user be clued into contacting either the academic SP's help desk or the campus's help desk. There's also a notion of credential translation that can occur when the different VO services are, have a heterogeneous, depending on how that architecture behind the SP works. And likewise, security then goes across all three layers. So Dean, hit the next slide if you would, please. And it's just it's complicated as it is. It's a little more so because unfortunately the current state of the art is that different campus IDPs have inconsistent practices among them. And so the academic SP has to also kind of smooth out or accommodate the inconsistent practices that it's subject to, that its users bring to it. And then one more button press, please, Dean. So the net risk that's being managed here, you can see on the left, the campus has it, but they also have most of the management levers with which to manage it in their own control. That's a good co-location of risk with capability to manage it. For the academic SP, they're stuck with the risk. There's no contracts to move it around anyplace else, which is the only way liability can be shared. And they have also correspondingly much less control over it. So they're in a more precarious situation that way. Next slide, please. I just wanted to, basically this slide is to demonstrate that I'm not making all this stuff up unless you find out that I've made up this slide too. This is an example of such an academic SP, and I'm not going to go into any of the details here, but just to note that all of those call-out boxes around the sides, first of all, you can note that the layers of the architecture diagram in the middle roughly mirror the layers that I had in my use case for an academic service provider in the previous slide. And all those call-outs are some of the kind of details about how some of those different management functions are accomplished in this specific instance of an SP. So it's real, and it's actually really complicated. A lot of risk to be managed. Next slide, please. And so it's inherently complex. We can manage that problem and reduce the complexity somewhat by doing some things, much of which is being done. We can have a common architecture, like the ARC blueprint architecture, so that not every research community and campus RCC, Research Computing Center, has to figure it out from scratch. There is one of those, at least. You can have common technical components so that not everyone has to write everything from scratch. Things like COmanage and a variety of other technologies exist to help support this. If you could, not quite done yet, Dean. I think Dean's giving me a hint that I should hurry up. You could also have community, of all the folks that have to do those things so they can help each other do them. And there are some instances of that I've listed here. Also some common services, kind of like the technical components, but operated as services. And that's what we're focusing on today, when Jim's going to talk about CILogon and Christos is going to talk about eduTEAMS. And then not to forget that identity providers should look at that, think about that pyramid, and really implement all the capabilities, certainly at the base. And when they've got those licked, to move up to the enabling the higher risk scenarios as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jim and tell us what's going on with CILogon.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tom, so much for that great introduction, setting the stage for this topic today. And yes, I'll be talking about CILogon, which stands for, the CI stands for Cyber Infrastructure. And that's all of the services and infrastructure, the computing and data and applications that are enabling these scientific collaborations and scientific applications that Tom was telling us about. So on the next slide, you will see a picture of the CILogon team. And all 6 of us are part-time on the CILogon team, 3 of us at NCSA here at the University of Illinois, and 3 people at Spherical Cow Group. And that's where we especially get COmanage expertise, but also identity management expertise in general to help us with the CILogon project. And on the next slide, you'll see our vision for CILogon, which is to enable seamless identity and access management for academic research collaborations. So to help the providers of research applications to make it easier for the researchers and scientists to gain access to those applications. So to do that, we want to make it easy for the researchers to use their campus identity, benefiting from InCommon and eduGain and Shibboleth. And we want the research collaboration to be able to manage onboarding and offboarding into and out of the collaboration. For example, when postdocs come in to an institution and then leave and move on to another research project, managing the collaboration-specific attributes and groups and roles that Tom told us about in the virtual organization, and do that in one place rather than separately in each application. And then use that identity and access management integrated into a variety of research applications, both web applications and applications on the command line that may need SSH keys or X509 certificates or LDAP callouts, for example. So on the next slide, I list a few examples of the types of applications that we support. Our history started out with supporting grid computing, which makes heavy use of X509 certificates for scalable distributed computing, but also we see a lot of use by science gateways. These are web applications that use web single sign-on protocols that benefit from our federated access. Jupyter Notebooks are another example of a common scientific web application for sharing your data analysis in a reproducible form. And so that's another web application that benefits from Web Single Sign-On. And also giving access to campus HPC clusters where your high-performance computing on campus is mostly used by people on that campus that are integrated with the campus identity management system, but they're collaborating with researchers on other campuses. And so you want to be able to plug into the other federated identities from those other campuses and connect it up with the campus's guest identity management system. And so on the next slide, you'll see how we realize that vision. We benefit a lot from the Internet 2 tier software stack, open source software that helps us manage those federated identities with Shibboleth, managing the onboarding and offboarding with COmanage, and also managing groups with Grouper. And understanding that many scientific collaborations don't have a team of full-time system administrators on staff, we provide this identity and access management service as a hosted service so that many collaborations can benefit from it without having to install the software themselves. And we can benefit from the economies of scale using the common platform across many collaborations. And so we've been in operation since 2010, and we've been growing the service offerings since then. And by amortizing this operation across many collaborations, we can improve the reliability and sustainability of the service. So on the next slide, you'll see a list of the open source software in addition to those tier components that we benefit from on the CILogon project. So there you see Shibboleth, COmanage, and Grouper listed again, but also some components we've developed over the years on the CILogon project, including an implementation of OpenID Connect, an OAuth 2 implementation, an X509 certificate authority. And we've also been integrating new components from the Identity Python project, PIF and Setosa, giving us better metadata management and better translation between SAML and OpenID Connect in proxying scenarios, and LDAP being a very important API to continue to support for many applications. We rely on LDAP. So on the next slide, you'll see that we've deployed this infrastructure to Amazon Web Services, and we're benefiting from the nice Net Plus offering from Internet 2 that includes discounts and nice network performance that we get in Amazon Web Services. For reliability, we're deploying across multiple availability zones, and we're deploying Docker containers in swarm mode, which gives us flexibility of maintaining these services, and then benefiting from Amazon services like Route 53 for DNS management, load balancing, reliable database service, elastic load balancing, elastic file system, etc. So on the next slide, you'll see that really a key component that makes all this work is the baseline of ReFED's research and scholarship. And Tom already talked about that just being the baseline for making collaboration work and for a campus being collaboration ready. Attribute release from campus continues to be the #1 stumbling block for new users getting access to our platform. And it's very important for CILogon to operate under the ReFED's research and scholarship policy, so our service qualifies for the ReFED's RNS attribute release from campuses. And so here are 2 URLs you can go to see if your campus supports ReFED's RNS, and you can actually test it out yourself. And on the next slide is actually a list of campuses, the InCommon campuses that today support ReFED's RNS. If you are at one of these campuses, great news. Congratulations, you're able to access research services in a federated way, in a seamless way. If you're from a campus that's not on this list and you're part of InCommon in the United States, you may be running into some attribute release trouble. And so you might want to talk to your campus IDP operators to get them on board with ReFED's RNS, because it's really key to enabling this identity and access management for research collaborations that we're talking about today. So on the next slide is an example of CILogon's consent screen. So in addition to what's stipulated in the refeds RNS policy, it's very important that we're also informing the user about what information is traveling from the campus through CILogon to the particular research application. Globus is the example shown here. And so CILogon, based on what the application is requesting through OpenID Connect scopes, will show the user that, yes, your name and email address is being requested, your affiliation from your identity provider. And so if you agree, and you can consult our privacy policy first, but if you agree, then you can proceed to log on. So on the next slide, I've got a short review of our 10-year history on the CILogon project. And it's been kind of fun to think back 10 years ago when we had a federal budget surplus that really launched a lot of great cyber infrastructure, including CILogon, that was awarded one of the ARRA awards back then, that allowed us to build on some initial work in TerraGrid to develop the CILogon service and launch our operations in 2010 with the initial bridge from SAML Shibboleth authentication to X509 certificates for grid computing. And so since then, over the years, we've had some additional awards from NSF and DOE that have allowed us to develop and begin operations of OAuth support, of higher levels of assurance like InComm Silver, connecting with important applications like Globus, supporting InComm RNS, and then later the International Refeds RNS version, connecting up with Exceed that provides very important baseline of operations support for CILogon as part of the Exceed infrastructure. And then in 2017, we started our collaboration with Spherical Cow Group that added the COmanage support for the additional collaboration management support that I talked about, and began our AWS deployment. And so this year we have transitioned from grant support to a subscription funding model on our path to sustainability. And so on the next slide, I want to talk about how really what we were hearing is a lot of questions and requests from the clients of CILogon, from the research collaborations, about the sustainability of CILogon as this hosted service. And what if the next grant doesn't come through to keep this thing running? And so we worked with our Office of Technology Management, and I guess the initial feedback we got was, this is not a typical transition to practice story. We don't have patents, it's open source software. We're focused on academic research use, not commercial use. And so it doesn't really seem like the perfect fit for things like SBIR or STTR or I-Corps that some of you may be familiar with. So on the next slide, I give a list of places where we got some really good advice, including the Internet 2 Eager project. South Alabama has a TTP program. SGCI, Science Gateway Community Institute, has a boot camp that gives advice about service sustainability, and also Trusted CI now has a TTP program. And so we collected a lot of this advice about how to sustain CILogon, and on the next slide, you'll see that we decided that our best option was to offer it as a service through the University of Illinois as a nonprofit service. And so we're leveraging a lot of university support services, the contract service, the finance department, purchasing department. And so we made the transition from grant funding with the program income fund to now a self-supporting fund down on campus, set up the subcontracts to Spherical Cow Group. University helps us manage our billing with Amazon Web Services, and also helps us manage our subscriber agreements and service activity rates. And so part of this was getting advice from the experts at the university about what to put in the agreement, how to set your activity rates in a way that is going to be fairly scalable to have subscribers sign up. So I'll mention it's really helpful as a subscriber if you use our standard agreement rather than negotiating something custom. It helps getting subscribers up and running more quickly. So on the next slide, there's a table showing our subscription model, which we developed in collaboration with the folks on campus about how to define a set of service prices and different levels of service that should get us to cost recovery. And so we go back to the university every couple of years and they check our spending and our income, and they make sure that what we're charging is not generating any long-term profit, but is actually just charging for the cost of the service. So you see here that basic authentication services, thanks to support from infrastructure like Exceed, is still available for free, but adding collaboration management services, including the hosted COmanage, begins to have a cost associated with it. You can see more details on our subscribe page there. So on the next slide, I want to give a plug to the Trusted CI TTP program that I mentioned previously. There is a transition to practice workshop coming up in June. And so if you'd like more information about that, check out the URL down there. If you're interested in operating a service or similar to, that has a similar transition to practice challenge that you're hearing about from CILogon or more generally, I think this will be a good resource. I'm looking forward to the discussion at that workshop in June. And so on the next slide, I'll also mention, while I'm plugging great stuff from Trusted CI, is also that Trusted CI provides consulting to assist NSF collaborations with their cybersecurity challenges, including identity and access management challenges. So if you came to the webinar today hoping that CILogon and eduTEAMS would solve all of your identity and access management challenges, I hope the answer is that they do, but if not, you have another option, which is to submit an application for assistance from Trusted CI. And currently the applications are open with a deadline of April 3rd. So with that, I'll show on my final slide my contact information, and I'll give my thanks for joining the webinar today. So please, I'll be watching the chat for questions and comments, but you can also follow up over email, and I'll turn it over to Christos.
Thank you very much, Jim. So welcome everybody. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So previous one. Tom mentioned about eduGain, and I would like to start my presentation by saying that thanks to eduGain, today more than 10 million users can use the same accounts that they use at their home organization in order to authenticate themselves to thousands of services and access content and resources that are available to them, either as members of their home organization or members of the wider academic community. Next slide, please. But the reality is that research rarely happens in isolation. Researchers need to be able to collaborate. They need to be able to access and share resources, not only available to their home organization, but available to the research collaborations they usually participate. So eduTEAMS is a service that enables the individual researchers to use their home organization accounts, but to be able to create their own virtual collaborations, set them up in the way that it meets their collaboration needs, and then share and access common resources and services as members of those particular research collaborations. Next slide. Before going further, I would like to take the opportunity to also discuss a little bit about how we came to the place that we are today. Back in 2012, when eduGain and the Interfederation service was a bit young service, it was a bit less than 2 years old, two communities did two separate studies trying to understand how federated identity management could be utilized within the research collaboration space. That was Terena from the one side that did the Terena AA study, and on the other side it was a group called Fin4R, which separately they tried to investigate the problem space of using federated identity management for enabling international research collaboration. Next slide, please. These two studies became the starting point for a project that was funded by the European Commission called Authentication Authorization for Research Collaboration. And in this project, we were able to bring together representatives from the research and education networks, representatives from the operators of the research infrastructures, but also representatives from the research communities themselves, in order to try to see how we could address the problems that were defined by the two studies that I mentioned. Next slide, please. The main outcome of the ARC project has been the ARC blueprint architecture, and Tom already mentioned that in his great introduction. Basically, what the ARC blueprint architecture tries to do is it tries to canonicalize or standardize an approach in trying to solve the problems of utilizing federated management and give guidance to implementers in scientific collaborations in developing, implementing, deploying their own authentication authorization infrastructures. The main concept that the ARC blueprint architecture brings is the notion of a proxy solution, where basically, instead of having the individual services that a community uses directly connected to the national federations and eduGAIN, to have a proxy in between that acts as the integration point between the community, the services the community uses, and the identity providers that a community might be using. Next slide, please. Last year, after around 6 years since the original publication of the FIM4R paper, excuse me, the wider scientific community came together in order to provide an updated version of that original paper and try to see within these 6 years and after, through iterations of the ARC project, to investigate where we stand in terms of solving the initial set of problems that were identified back in 2012. This led basically to the FIM4R version 2 paper, which was published in June last year. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I suggest that you go over. This is a very interesting reading, and I believe it captures in a very detailed manner where we stand today, what is the ground that we have already covered, but also what are the steps that we're still missing and we need to take in the years to come. Next slide, please. So eduTEAMS is a service that Zeant has developed that enables the use of federated management within the research and academic collaborations. It is a full implementation of the ARC blueprint architecture, and it is meant to provide an easy way for research collaborations to set up their virtual collaboration and manage resources and identities across that virtual collaboration. Next slide, please. So eduTEAMS is comprised of 4 major technological components: the eduTEAMS proxy and identity hub, the eduTEAMS metadata service and discovery service, the eduTEAMS membership management service, and the Zeant step-up authentication service for those use cases that require strong authentication. All of these components are being supported by different technologies. I will not go into detail about this right now, but you can find more information about this at the end of my presentation, where we provide links. What eduTEAMS does is it brings together a number of technology stacks in a way that is provided to the user as a uniform service that integrates all of these technical components in one performance service according to the ARC blueprint architecture. Next slide, please. So the major point of eduTEAMS is that users using eduTEAMS, they can sign into services using their community identity. So the community is the important part, but authenticated at their home organizations. And with eduTEAMS, basically users can register once with their community and then access any service that is available to their community and their community and their collaboration. eduTEAMS is also very interesting, not just for the end users, it's also very interesting for the community itself and the operators of the infrastructure of the community, because it reduces significantly the complexity for service providers that are making the service available to the community, as it provides one single integration point for all the services that will be made available to the community. So instead of having the services themselves to manage the complexity of a multi-federation environment, this is handled by eduTEAMS itself on behalf of the service providers, and the service providers need just to implement a technical connection with one integration point. Furthermore, within the European context, eduTEAMS is already enabled and connected with the European Open Science Cloud, which is an initiative to basically provide one science cloud that will be available for all European researchers, and through which research communities in Europe will be able to access and consume services. In the next slide, I will talk a little bit more about the European Science Cloud, just to give you an idea of how things are being developed in Europe. This is the high-level architecture of the authentication authorization infrastructure that is envisioned for the European Open Science Cloud. Basically, the concept is that a research community has its own authentication authorization infrastructure service. It might be operated by the community, or it might be outsourced to a separate operator. And then this community basically uses services that are community-focused services developed by the community itself, or generic services widely available, for example, via eduGain, like from commercial service providers, or services which are provided to European researchers through generic infrastructures that are available in Europe, like compute services from EGI, storage services from EUDAT, cloud network services from XEANT. Next slide, please. eduTEAMS is a solution in this high-level architecture for the research community to set up, configure, and manage their own authentication authorization infrastructure service. But as you can see in the next slide, eduTEAMS can also be used as a way to integrate services and make them available to multiple research communities. So for example, XEANT is using components of the eduTEAMS service in order to provide services to European research communities. Next slide, please. So eduTEAMS comes in three offerings. We have the eduTEAMS service, we have what we call the eduTEAMS dedicated offering, and we have what we call the eduTEAMS bespoke offering. In the next slide, I will go into a bit more detail about these three different offerings. So the eduTEAMS service is a shared platform that we offer to small and medium-sized communities and what we call the long tail of science, the individual researchers that might be active within specific research fields that do not necessarily comprise one community by themselves. The service is a hosted service, managed and operated by XEANT. I think this is a very interesting similarity with also what Jim presented with CILogon. And the service is branded as eduTEAMS. This is a XEANT service branded as eduTEAMS, and as such, it also bears the eduTEAMS community identifier. So all users and communities using the eduTEAMS service, basically, they will be using one identifier that will be eduTEAMS-based identifier. Because the service is operated and offered and owned by XEANT, the service policies are defined by eduTEAMS and XEANT. And as I mentioned before, it's already connected to the European Open Science Cloud. But we also allow the onboarding of community-specific services that will be used on this service. The eduTEAMS service for the small and medium communities at the moment is going to be free of charge, and it will be basically provided by the GN4 project series. The next offering is what we call eduTEAMS dedicated. So next slide, please. eduTEAMS dedicated is basically us using the technology stack of eduTEAMS and the know-how that we have to offer a solution for communities that want to have their own dedicated installation on their own infrastructure as a white label offering that will be branded according to the needs of the community. It will be managed by the community, but still it will be operated by Zeant, which means that actually the community will not have to have the operational capabilities required to offer such a service. It can rely on Zeant's operational capabilities to have this service delivered to them. The service will supports community branding, and this community will own their own specific identifier on that service. And because the community is managing the service, also the policies are managed by the community itself on that, on this offering. Of course, because we have a lot of experience in developing the policies and the requirements to make the service production service as Zeant, this is something that we can offer as a consultation to the communities that are using the eduTEAMS dedicated. Given that we already have the capability to connect to the European Open Science Cloud, this is something that we offer to all the communities that are using eduTEAMS dedicated. And of course, the communities can connect their own specific service on the platform and use the ability to have multi-protocol service support, so they can connect openly connected services, SAML services, etc. Next slide, please. The third offering is what we call eduTEAMS Bespoke. Basically, it's again taking the eduTEAMS technology that we use to run the eduTEAMS service and to offer eduTEAMS dedicated. But here, basically, we try to address a need that has become very apparent during the last years. Many communities come to us and say, you know what, we would like something like eduTEAMS, but either we have already some of the components already available and we have been operating them in our research infrastructure, we don't want to outsource them, or we want some functionality that is not already available as part of your existing offering. What you can do about it? And this is how we built basically the eduTEAMS Bespoke offering, meaning that either we can use parts of the eduTEAMS technology stack and integrate it with existing infrastructure that the community and research infrastructure might have, or develop new functionality that is tailored to that community and which could not be justified as a generic feature that would be available for eduTEAMS itself. The eduTEAMS model, the ownership model is dependent on the solution, but again, the idea is that Zeant will be operating the service on behalf of the community. And as part of eduTEAMS Bespoke, we will be offering also consultancy, development, and hosting of the service. Next slide, please.
So, Christos, before we go, actually, Dean, if you could move it back one slide. There's a couple of questions, one for both you and Jim that just came into the chat, but we can start with you, which is, are these services offered exclusively for research purposes, or if, for example, someone wanted to leverage one or the other for some more administrative or campus internal purposes rather than inter-campus use cases, would those be, would eduTEAMS, first of all, Christos, be available for that kind of use?
That's very, very good question, and I was coming to that, but let me answer this now. Right now, we focus eduTEAMS for research collaboration. The reason we do this is because we know very well that space. Having said that, and as I will show in a few slides, we also are developing in the background solutions for the research and education networks to offer to their constituents within the research networks themselves. So we eventually are going to make an offering also for campuses and NRENs to offer eduTEAMS as a service to them. And we have already started working with some NRENs towards that direction, and I will say a few words about this. But at the moment, we are at the position where we try to understand the problem space there. It is not as clear as the research collaboration space it is to us right now.
Thanks. And Jim, how about you, your answer for CILogon?
I think our answer is very similar, that research collaborations is really the focus of our service offering. But on the table that I showed of our services, there was a final line about custom services that we could potentially stand up separate service instances for in AWS, but still benefit from the same container architecture and same underlying architecture, but set up services that are customized for a different use case that may, for example, not depend on Refed's RNS policies. Thanks.
Thanks. And then there was one other question from me, so I'll ask it right now while we've got you paused, which was to Christos. Does the eduTEAMS service, the service, or the white label one, or the one that's operated by Xeon, does that include any really common collaboration services like Wiki or email list, that kind of thing?
Right now, no. But it is in our plans basically to start working with service providers and start integrate them on the platform and making them available to all communities that will be using the platform. This is part of the next step that we'll be doing in 2019, trying to introduce content on the platform itself. And our primary, of course, source for such services are the NRAs themselves. They do operate already services like collaboration services like the ones that you described, and we want to start onboarding them on the platform so that they can make them available to communities that they already support through eduTEAMS.
Thanks, Christos, and I guess back to you to continue the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tom. Actually, these questions were very good. Just let me say a few things about the infrastructure which we use for eduTEAMS. For the eduTEAMS service, which we basically operate on the AWS. Of course, we deploy it on European regions of AWS for GDPR purposes. But the technology, the eduTEAMS technology supports automated installation and deployment also on OpenStack clusters and on the Okeanos cloud platform that's provided by one of our NRENs. This gives us the ability to deploy eduTEAMS dedicated and bespoke instances to multiple cloud providers and actually leverage the wide network of NRENs that we have that offer cloud services to their community. So if one of our customers already has an infrastructure as a service capability and they're using OpenStack or Okeanos, then we can also leverage that to deploy the service and manage it on that platform. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. So I put a slide with users exactly actually to address the comment that you made, Tom, a few minutes ago. Right now, we're working with a number of communities. Here you see in a few examples, we have the life science community. When I say communities here, these are large-scale communities. Basically, life sciences, photonutrient community are what we call cluster research infrastructure in Europe. So basically, they are multi-community collaborations which bring all the major research communities in Europe that are active within a specific research space. And we are working with them to provide the AI service for them. So this is a very good example of how I work with some major communities. But on top of that, we are working also with high-performance computing centers and try to help them provide federated services to their own users, and of course, through them, supporting again a number of communities. So this is a different target than research communities themselves. This is actually the resource owners of high-performance computing centers which want to provide their services to a number of communities. And the last thing is basically the NRENs that I mentioned before. So we're already working with Rediris, with SafeNet, but also with JISC in providing eduTEAMS as a service to now an NREN and trying to see in this process how we can deliver services to the NRENs and to the campuses. We have gone quite far with SafeNet and Rediris, two different models there. For SafeNet, we basically work with them on a model where we deliver eduTEAMS as a service that they can use, as a hosted service that they can use for all their communities within the Netherlands. For Rediris, we have a different model where we actually enable the Rediris Research and Education Network to support one of the communities that has already an infrastructure, but is using OpenID Connect, and they want to utilize, to use identities coming from the National Federation of eduGAIN, and they want to bridge the OpenID Connect infrastructure that they have with SAML. And there we use eduTEAMS basically as that bridge that will enable this community to access eduGAIN identities. Next slide, please. As part of the collaboration we have with our communities, we have a roadmap that is publicly available. You can see that this is coming soon. It was before, it was from the presentation we had at the Internet Global Summit. Now this is a public version of that roadmap, and we do consult with the community to see where we're heading. The idea is to give some hints to our users of what's coming next, meaning what's coming in the next few months ahead from where we are today. Next slide, please. Our development team works in their own isolated environment, and everything that we do in eduTEAMS is fully tested. So we have a range of unit tests to functional testing for all the components that we develop and support. And for each customer, we deploy basically 2 environments on the infrastructure that they choose to use. One environment is the acceptance environment, where we do everything, all the new developments or the new configurations before they're deployed to production. And of course, the production environment that is actually made available to provide the actual service to the users. Next slide, please. So if you want to learn more about eduTEAMS, there was an article in the Connect magazine from Jan that was published, I think, today or yesterday. This is a very interesting reading of what eduTEAMS is. At TNC in June, from June 17th to June 20th, we're going to have a full session on eduTEAMS where we're going to discuss in more depth what we're doing with eduTEAMS, what is the experience from communities, etc. And in the next slide, you will see that very soon, actually, I think in a couple of weeks from now, we will be launching the new eduTEAMS website that will include a lot of information on how eduTEAMS works and how you can actually request and create your own research organization on eduTEAMS and try eduTEAMS in a real environment. So next slide, please. That was my last slide, and I would like to thank you very much for the time I was given for this EM Online. And I don't know if we're taking questions now or how we're going to manage this, but I would like to thank you all very much.
I think it'd be fine if there are further questions from anybody. We have a couple of minutes left, and that would be a great use of them if you have them. Majid asked, can the slides be downloaded? And I know, Dean, that I think at the top of the hour, you indicated they're going to be available within the next couple of hours, I think later today, at the IAM online website. Is that right? Yes, there we go. Any other questions from folks? Well, I'll just thank both Jim and Christos. This is really interesting and important stuff and complicated stuff. And I just hope it continues, what you guys are doing each and others like you, continues to be successful. That's all. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to give 5 minutes back to everyone today. See you guys next time.